Hi everyone, I am here to do a quick demo of a faceted apple. So we're starting with the large forms, the major forms of the apple. Rather than looking for the light and the dark, we look for the shape of the apple as if we were a sculptor. Here I'm dropping in some of the ellipses, making sure that they're symmetrical and that they lay flat on the surface of the drawings. Then I go and I weight some of the lines and build up the mass to really kind of reinforce the idea that this has volume. The weighted lines kind of help me see where to begin with the deepest elements in the painting. I usually start with the medium darks to darkest elements in the painting and build from there. And if you'll notice, I'm basically following the elements, the faceted elements that I've already laid out with the painted drawing. So as I go forward with this, it's nice to remember that a lot of times as we're lightening, especially when it comes to reds, we needn't add white. A lot of times if you can find a middle valued color that serves the purpose, you get a much richer, less muddied effect. If we avoid mixing all of our values to lighter values with white and instead choose rich middle values right off of the palette or right out of the tube. I'm not suggesting that we work just out of the tube, but simply when you look at your value scale, look for those colors that start at a lighter value, that begin at a darker value, and so on. And a lot of times those mid-value or light value colors can be a fantastic way to lighten the color you're working with without muddying it as white so often can do. So as you can see now, I've started to kind of build up the form, and I'm well into the middle values. I'm looking for some of the highlights, and at this point, because of the cool reflected quality of some of the light on the apple as our subject, I am mixing little bits of white into the color. And the difference, of course, between a cadmium red light, for example, which is a very warm red, or an ultra or a quinacridone red, for example, which is cool, is very pronounced when we start to add white. You'll notice the difference between the cool and warm color immediately. I like to really be clear with every brushstroke that I make that I'm following the faceted form beneath. And if you'll notice here, the facets toward the edge of the rounded form begin to narrow and get thinner and thinner. So when you're building your form, notice that. Notice how some of the facets will be larger and generally wider in space as you face them, and as they turn away from you, they narrow and thin toward the edges. And that really helps to add a sense of mass. Now blocking in some of the background, weighting it with that shadow. Generally, I like to kind of move fast and furiously through a lot of this process, but not without some attention to the undulation of color that can occur even on a flat surface. It's important to record the differences in warm and cool that happen even in the background. If we spend all of our time in the foreground and don't put any energy in or thought into the background, the paintings tend to be fairly weak. You can see how I'm bringing some of these dark shadows in around it, and the apple is just popping. The shadow's cool, the light here is warm for the most part, and now as I start to put in the chrome picture, it'll all pop a little later in this video, but right now I'm just looking for the dark elements and really trying to make sure that I keep it symmetrical and sitting flat on the surface of the table. Little bits of warmth in the lights, neutralizing them a bit, coming around. I try to just keep that paint moving at all times, and I do take more time than you would guess mixing my color, but it doesn't appear that way, first of all, because the video's sped up a little bit, and second of all, because I've been doing it for a long time. So take your time when you're mixing on your palette. Test, do a little test here and there and see if you have the right color, and then make a correction if you don't. That's what I do. So you can already see that there's a bit of sheen happening in the background there. Not too much, it's not super believable, but we're getting a nice sense of contrast in the silver of the background object, and the pear here, or excuse me, the apple in the foreground is looking pretty great too. Now putting a couple of zingers in, and notice I waited. You keep the zingers for the end. Don't eat your dessert first in this case. Build that form, build that mask, lay down the foundation of your image, and then, only then, when everything is kind of thought out and generally the values are established, do we start bringing in some of these little highlights. Even then, I've put in generally something just below the lightest light before I'll add a highlight on top, so that it can kind of come gradually forward and emerge. You can even see that on the highlight on the apple there. There's a bit of a darker highlight and then the zinger on top. Now I'm pushing some of that contrast that I see on the table, throwing down some bolder brush strokes, keeping this painting active and alive. I like to switch brushes from time to time too. Of course you can do it all with one brush, keeping it clean, but for example on the table, it's nice to have a more gestural element. Anyway, that's it. Then it's time to eat the apple and call it a day. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed Faceting the Apple.